Between 1943 and 1944, the French resistance not only fought the German occupiers, it also waged a silent, direct, and lethal war against its own compatriots, the collaborators of the Nazi regime. Every traitor identified was a threat that must be eliminated. There were no trials or warnings. A warrant, a license plate, an address were enough. Some were shot down on the highway, others were kidnapped, interrogated, and executed without a trace. Many collaborators died knowing their names had been marked for weeks. Among them were high-ranking officials, police officers, informers, and civilians who sold information in exchange for favors. Violette Morris, the execution of the most feared traitor. In the early hours of April 26, 1944, a scene of clandestine warfare shattered the rural stillness of the road connecting Lieuret to Epeigne in Normandy. A Citroën traction Avant was moving slowly forward when, without warning, it was hit by a thunderous burst of machine gun fire. The engine burst into flames. The windows shattered. The vehicle stopped at the side of the road, completely riddled with bullets. Inside, all the occupants were dead, including the prime target of the attack, Violette Morris, one of the most infamous collaborators of the Nazi regime in France. It was the culmination of a life as extravagant as it was dangerous. A woman who broke all the norms of her time and in her later years decided to betray her country by allying herself with her executioners. For the French resistance, she wasn't simply a traitor. She was a monster, a torturer, a threat. The execution was swift, violent, and deliberately symbolic. With Morris's death, the resistance was sending a message. There would be no mercy for collaborators. Violette Morris was born on April 18, 1893, in Paris. The daughter of an army officer, she was educated in convents but always felt uncomfortable with the social limits imposed on women. During World War I, she served as an ambulance driver on the front lines, already displaying a bold and rebellious personality. But her legend began to take shape in the 1920s. A prodigious athlete, Morris excelled in disciplines as diverse as boxing, cycling, swimming, shot put, and especially motor racing. She became a champion at the Monte Carlo Women's Games and was a regular figure in the media for her openly defiant lifestyle. She wore men's clothing, smoked in public, spoke crudely, and had a romantic relationship with another woman, Yvonne Debray. In 1928, she was banned by the French Federation of Women's Sports for immoral behavior. She was barred from competing. Public humiliation was the first major turning point in her life. During the 1930s, she fell into economic marginalization. Abandoned by sports circles and scorned by the press, her resentment toward the French Republic grew, as did her closeness to fascist circles. In 1936, Violette was invited by Gertrude Hanecker, an agent of the SD, Sicherheitsdienst, the Nazi intelligence service, to the Berlin Olympics. She was presented to Adolf Hitler as the prototype of the new European woman. From then on, she became an informant for the Reich. Her contacts and technical knowledge proved crucial. She handed over schematics of the French Saumur S-35 tank and data on fortifications along the Maginot Line. Her betrayal was already underway. With the occupation of Paris in 1940, Morris enthusiastically joined the collaborationist movement. She joined the Carling, the French political police serving the Gestapo. Operating from her houseboat on the Seine, she was accused of participating in the torture of members of the resistance. Testimonies from survivors and Allied sources stated that she personally beat prisoners, used straps, tubes, and shock methods. She was nicknamed the hyena of the Gestapo. His collaboration wasn't just ideological or expedient, he also profited from it. He owned an auto repair shop that serviced the Luftwaffe and supplied fuel on the black market. He is credited with dozens of fatal denunciations. The resistance didn't forget. Despite her civilian camouflage, Violette's figure was too recognizable, too dangerous. The Surcouf group, linked to the French Forces of the Interior, FFI, planned her elimination for weeks. They obtained information about her usual route in Normandy. They knew she traveled armed, that she was accompanied by other collaborators, and that she wouldn't give up easily. The operation was simple but effective. Hidden among the trees, the resistance fighters waited for the Citroën to appear. When the car entered the firing zone, the attack began. Rifle bullets, Sten gun fire, and machine gun fire ripped through the vehicle. 5 adults, including Morris and 2 children, died instantly. The fact that miners were traveling in the car caused some unease even within the resistance itself, but the commanders justified it. They were all collaborators. War makes no distinction between innocents in the enemy's machinery. Violette Morris's body, unrecognizable from the gunshot wounds, was taken to the local morgue. No one claimed her body. She was buried in a mass grave without a headstone, mass, or mourning. For many, Violette Morris's death was a liberation. Her name had become synonymous with terror. The underground press celebrated it as an act of poetic justice. Some publications of the time wrote, "The animal has fallen. Paris breathes." However, over the years, voices have emerged that question the true extent of her collaboration. Some historians, especially in recent decades, have suggested that she may have been used as a scapegoat. A woman leading a dissident life, hated both for her collaboration and for violating gender norms. Her role as a spy has been widely documented, but the exact extent of her involvement in torture is still a matter of debate. The truth is that in SD and Gestapo files, her name appears linked to multiple repressive operations. She was also mentioned by British SOE agents as a person of interest. In liberated France, her reputation alone was enough to justify her execution. The story of Violette Morris doesn't end with her death. For decades, she was ignored by official historiography. No one honored her. In post-war France, her name was spoken only to remind us of betrayal. She was erased like a stain, but her execution marks a crucial moment in the history of the resistance, the transition from defense to justice by force of arms. The action against her was not legal. There was no trial, no lawyer, no appeal, just a road, some bullets and a shot body. The Gestapo hyena met the end many expected, but at the very limit of what separates justice from revenge. Liberation of France, lynchings and popular revenge. With the withdrawal of German troops and the Allies' entry into Paris in August 1944, France awoke in freedom and fury. For 4 years, the nation had been driven into darkness by the occupying machine and by its own compatriots, who had become willing executioners. Liberation not only meant the end of Nazi domination, for many it meant the opportunity to settle scores. The accumulated humiliation, the private mourning, the social betrayal, the wounds opened by denunciations, deportations, and torture needed an escape valve, and that valve was violence. The initial euphoria that followed the fall of the Third Reich on French soil did not lead to immediate order, but rather to a wave of spontaneous reprisals. In dozens of liberated cities, the streets became the scene of collective punishments. An accusation from a neighbor, a word whispered in the right ear, a photograph in a confiscated archive, a suspicious glance were enough to trigger a sentence. Institutional justice, absent or incapable of processing the avalanche of names, was replaced by street justice. Faceless and unrestrained crowds settled debts in public squares. In Grenoble, just days after the German withdrawal, 6 young men were executed in what became one of the most symbolic episodes of the period. They were members of the milice, the Vichy regime's paramilitary force responsible for repressing the resistance. They were taken from their cells without a formal trial and taken to an old brick kiln on the outskirts of the city. Tied to rusty poles, they were shot in front of thousands of people. Among the spectators were mothers with children, the elderly, and men who had lost their brothers at the front. The silence before the shots was absolute. Afterward, the crowd burst into applause. The execution was filmed, photographed, and commented on. The bodies remained visible for a time, as a warning and catharsis. The choice of location was no coincidence. It was there that the Germans had shot 23 resistance fighters weeks earlier. Now, the cycle of death was changing direction. Dijon experienced an even more brutal scene. Jacques Larsac, a former police chief linked to the collaborationist repressive apparatus, was dragged from his cell by a mob that refused to wait for the court's verdict. His death was as brutal as it was symbolic. He was dragged, insulted, beaten, hung from a traffic light, and paraded before the town hall. The scene was witnessed by a diverse and raucous crowd in an atmosphere more reminiscent of a medieval execution than a transition to democracy. People sang, laughed, and took photos. The body became a trophy, and his death a spectacle. Popular anger knew no class, age, or background. One of the most controversial manifestations was the systematic violence against women accused of having relations with German soldiers. It didn't matter whether they were forced, whether they did it out of hunger, fear, or true love. In the eyes of many, these women were neither victims nor people. They were emblems of an outrage against national honor. The punishment was as public as it was symbolic. They were shaved in central squares, partially naked, painted with swastikas, and forced to parade amid spitting and mockery. The photographs taken by Allied correspondents went around the world, women with their heads bowed, surrounded by insults, children pointing, men smiling. In some cases, even the babies born of these relations were also humiliated or abandoned. The scene was repeated hundreds, perhaps thousands of times. It is estimated that more than 20,000 women were subjected to these public humiliations. Some were executed, others were scarred for life. In small towns where everyone knew each other, a single accusation was enough to cause disgrace. In large cities, the mobs were more anonymous but just as ferocious. The collective prevailed over the individual, and the emotional over any notion of justice. At the heart of this violence lay a painful paradox. The resistance in the name of freedom had had to operate clandestinely, silently, under constant threat. When the country was liberated, that same structure, now legitimized by victory, was not always able or willing to channel its power through legal mechanisms. In many cases, what was unleashed was a second war, not against a foreign enemy, but against the nation's internal phantoms. The purge was neither orderly nor centralized. It was piecemeal, uneven, sometimes coordinated and sometimes completely spontaneous. In some places, liberation committees attempted to establish criteria. In others, fury was the only guide. Charles de Gaulle, aware of the chaos, adopted an ambivalent stance. While he called for restoring the authority of the state and curbing abuses, he also accepted that spontaneous purges were part of the process. The provisional administration lacked the means to control thousands of cases of collaboration. Summary justice was therefore tolerated in the name of historical necessity. For many French people, such acts were the only possible reparation. For others, they were a symptom that the nation had lost, in addition to the war, a part of its soul. The passage of time did not soothe all the wounds. When the fog of war dissipated, doubts began to arise. How many of those executed were executed for personal reasons disguised as patriotic justice? How many women were marked by jealousy or envy rather than by real actions? Archives, belated testimonies, and post-war investigations revealed dozens of errors, manipulations, and private vendettas camouflaged as patriotism. Some of those executed were forcibly recruited adolescents. Others were simple employees who could not escape the state apparatus. Many of the humiliated women had done nothing more than survive. What happened in 1944 was a brutal expression of a broken nation. The resistance had won, but its victory was not without shadows. The executions without trial, mass lynchings, and public humiliation were not just consequences of pain, they were also symptoms of a country that, in finding its voice, shouted too loudly. The line between justice and violence blurred. Collective rage didn't wait for proof. It only needed a visible victim. Post-war French people had to confront this uncomfortable truth. Not all crimes were committed by the occupiers. Some were born among them. In the same streets where Nazi flags had once been raised, sentences were now carried out without a judge. On the same balconies from which the invader had been saluted, the mockery was applauded. Collective memory was slow to accept these episodes. For years, people preferred to speak of the glory of liberation rather than its excesses. But the photographs, the archives, the anonymous graves remained. And with them, the persistent question, what is gained when justice becomes a spectacle? The harvest of hatred was real, it was massive, and while for many it marked the end of a period of suffering, for others it ushered in a new era of uncomfortable silences and hidden guilt. The post-war period began not with reconciliation, but with the echo of gunshots, shaved heads, and bodies dragged through the streets. The blood stopped flowing by order of the enemy, but that didn't stop it from flowing. Fire on the traitors, the hunts of the French resistance. In occupied France between 1940 and 1944, not all enemies wore German uniforms. The French collaborator was the silent enemy, often indistinguishable from the neighbor, the shopkeeper, the policeman, the priest. In a context of national humiliation, rationing, propaganda, and fear, thousands of French citizens chose to serve the interests of the Third Reich. Betrayal took many forms: denunciation, repression, torture, administration of plunder, and even direct participation in deportations. But beyond the specific gesture, the concrete decision to collaborate, there was a deep structural matrix that allowed this betrayal to flourish in all social strata, in all regions, with every imaginable justification. Who were these traitors really? What drove them? Did they act out of ideology, necessity, revenge, or simply fear? Collaborationism was not a marginal phenomenon or exclusive to fanatics or criminals. It was a dark mirror reflecting a fractured society besieged by its own historical demons and pushed to the abyss by the occupation. This chapter seeks to unravel not only the identity of the collaborators, but also the social, psychological, and political mechanisms that made them possible. Not to justify their behavior, but to understand how betrayal is woven into the living body of a defeated nation. Many members of the militia and other collaborationist organizations didn't discover authoritarianism with the arrival of German troops. They already carried it within them, like a seed that only needed fertile soil to grow. They were old militants of nationalist groups, nostalgic for order and empire, men who saw in the collapse of 1940 confirmation that liberal democracy had failed. For them, the fall of France was not just a military defeat, but the symptom of a moral malaise. They found in the new order a promise of renewal, a crusade against communism, Judaism, liberalism, and all forms of modern decadence. Germany offered the model of a rejuvenated, disciplined, racially pure homeland without parties or strikes, with no concessions to pluralism. Many volunteered before even a formal structure of collaboration existed. In their minds, they weren't betraying France, they were saving it from itself. The case of Joseph Darnand illustrates this mentality. A decorated veteran of the Great War who became supreme leader of the militia, he ended up swearing personal loyalty to Hitler in 1943. He did so with conviction, with absolute ideological clarity, believing himself to be the heir of the true France. In his circle, obedience to the Reich was not submission, but a strategic alliance for national regeneration. His men saw themselves not as executioners, but as sentinels of a threatened civilization. But that conviction, ironclad blind, was only one of many routes to betrayal. In other cases, collaboration was simply a way to survive. Occupied France was a broken country. Cities suffered power outages, villages were isolated, and hunger was a permanent resident. The Germans were taking resources, the economy was paralyzed, and unemployment was rising. In this context, belonging to the Vichy administration or the collaborationist forces offered unthinkable advantages. A fixed salary, access to better rations, and protection from compulsory labor service in Germany. Attracted by these promises, many young men with no trade or hope joined the militia or the police. Some were displaced peasants, others unemployed workers, and quite a few were common criminals who were offered amnesty in exchange for service. For many, it was a pragmatic choice, enlist or starve. At that point, collaboration became a wage. Collaboration was also passive. Not everyone took up arms or participated in raids. Many simply agreed to work in regime offices, conducting censuses, drawing up lists, guarding warehouses, and sealing documents. The machinery of subjugation required civil servants, archivists, drivers, and clerks. It was enough not to ask questions, to obey orders without argument, to look away when someone disappeared. A signature, a misspelled number, a folder delivered on time could mean the death of another. And yet, for thousands of French people, these tasks were part of normality. There was no remorse, only routine. France wasn't just an occupied country. It was a country divided by its own internal fissures. The defeat amplified historical tensions between regions, between social classes, between worldviews. For many collaborators, the enemy wasn't just the German, but the other Frenchman. That arrogant bourgeois from Paris, that rebellious trade unionist, that Jewish neighbor with a difficult surname, that communist with a foreign accent. The wounds of the Popular Front, the revenge of the countryside against the city, of Catholicism against secularism, of the provinces against the capital, reopened under the occupation, and collaboration offered a tool to settle scores. Vichy and Reich propaganda only sharpened these divisions. It fueled resentment and offered justifications. The collaborator didn't feel like an executioner, but rather an executor of an ancient justice, a historical revenge. Thus, hatred mutated into duty. In many villages, an anonymous accusation was enough to make someone disappear. It was enough to suggest that a political rival was hiding weapons or helping Jews to set the wheels of repression in motion. Behind many denunciations, there was neither ideology nor money. There was envy, jealousy, and ancient grudges. The role of women in this network was more complex than official history has been willing to admit. While the most widely disseminated image is that of the young women shaved their heads after the liberation for having had relations with German soldiers, their involvement ran deeper. Many actively collaborated as translators, as spies, as Gestapo secretaries. Some participated in interrogations, others betrayed refugees in exchange for privileges or out of fear. The figure of Violette Morris, a former athlete turned torturer, embodies that grey area between the fascination with power and remorseless cruelty. But at the same time, many other women collaborated in more ambiguous ways, protecting their children, trying to save relatives, giving in to blackmail. The punishment many of them received after the war was disproportionate. While some collaborating men managed to escape, go into hiding, or negotiate their impunity, thousands of women were publicly humiliated, raped, and branded. Female collaboration was seen as a double betrayal to the homeland and to morality, but their circumstances were rarely considered. Justice was replaced by fury. Collaboration was also invisible, silent, deeply rooted in social sectors that never wore an armband. There were doctors who refused to treat members of the resistance, lawyers who helped dispossess Jewish families, officials who validated false documents for German agents. There were teachers who expelled undesirable students, priests who legitimized repression from the pulpit, journalists who constructed toxic narratives to justify violence. Each, in their own sphere, contributed to sustaining the scaffolding of horror. Without their participation, the occupier would have been clumsier, slower, more vulnerable. It was the collaboration of those who never fired a shot that made the occupation's effectiveness possible. Collaboration in France wasn't a side note. It was a massive, transversal, almost organic phenomenon. It encompassed the rich and the poor, the old and the young, believers and atheists, conservatives and progressives. Each found their justification, their excuse, their reason. Some did it out of ideological loyalty, others out of fear of being deported, many simply because they could, and because they knew no one would stop them. After the liberation, France had to look in the mirror, and the reflection wasn't heroic, it was uncomfortable, familiar, disturbing. The enemy didn't just speak German, he also had a French surname, wore a beret, and sold bread on the corner. Betrayal didn't come from outside, it sprang from within. Understanding the anatomy of the French collaborator means accepting that betrayal is not an extraordinary act, but a mechanism that can be activated in any fractured society, under pressure, in times of fear. It doesn't always manifest itself in weapons or speeches. Sometimes it hides in a signed sheet of paper, in a look that avoids meeting, in a word that is withheld when it matters most. The line between duty and betrayal is more fragile than we would like to believe, and that fragility is precisely what makes it essential not to forget it. French milice, terror born among the French. The Milice Française, or simply the Milice, was not just a political force created by the Vichy regime to sustain its legitimacy among the French people. It was an instrument of brutal, systematic and deeply ideologized repression, operating with the blessing and direct support of the Nazi occupiers. Comprised of French people who chose to fight against other French people, its existence embodies the most sinister face of collaboration. While the Wehrmacht and the Gestapo maintained general territorial control, the militia acted as the scalpel of terror, penetrating the most intimate layers of French society. Neighborhoods, towns, streets, families. Their knowledge of the terrain and local connections made them an irreplaceable and feared tool. Survivor testimonies, post-war trial archives, and personal memoirs all agree on one point: the milice tortured with calculated and dehumanizing violence. It wasn't random violence, it was functional, designed to destroy bodies, break wills, and extract confessions, names, lists, and addresses. Among the methods used were systematic beatings with batons, whips, or belts. These were applied to the thighs, back, ribs, and face. Electric shocks were used with improvised dynamos connected to genitals or fingers, simulated asphyxiation with wet cloth bags or immersing the head in buckets of dirty water, mutilations with razors or lit cigars applied to the nipples, fingernails or groin. Extreme deprivation techniques included prolonged starvation, isolation, and exposure to cold. The typical torture chamber was a windowless basement with walls plastered to muffle screams. In Paris, one of the most feared centers was the one on Rue Lauriston, headquarters of the French Gestapo, where collaborators and Germans worked together. Documents survive of dozens of prisoners who were tied up, hung from hooks, beaten until they fainted, and then returned to their cells only to repeat the process the next day. Detention centers controlled by the militia or shared with the Gestapo were scattered across multiple cities, some of the most notorious, Fort de Montluc, Lyon, the milice's central prison where thousands of resistance fighters were interrogated, Hotel Terminus, Bordeaux, converted into a torture and execution center, Frasnes Prison, Paris, officially under German control but with an active presence of French collaborators, Maison d'Arrêt in Toulouse, where extended interrogations were conducted, led by French officers. In these facilities, not only armed combatants were tortured, but also civilians, printers, messengers, priests, doctors, even children who had acted as liaisons. Records showed dozens of deaths from internal bleeding, skull fractures, and untreated sepsis. The milice did not act alone. From its founding in 1943 under the leadership of Joseph Darnand, it operated as a local branch of the German Gestapo, specializing in tracking down resistance fighters, hidden Jews, escaped prisoners, and deserters. Darnand, a fervent anti-Semite and veteran of the First World War, swore personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler. This effectively turned the milice into a semi-autonomous SS unit. Many of its cadres received training in Germany, some even fought on the Eastern Front in the Waffen-SS's Charlemagne division. This direct collaboration resulted in joint operations. A landmark example was the dismantling of the combat network in Lyon, led by Klaus Barbie, but carried out with the logistical and tactical assistance of the local militia. In the final months of the occupation, as the resistance gained ground, the militia radicalized its actions. Many prisoners were not interrogated but executed outright, in some cases in retaliation for Maquis attacks. In others, to erase evidence, punish entire communities, or spread terror. A brutal case was the execution of 34 prisoners in Saint-Pierre prison in Paris following a prison riot. The order came directly from militia leaders who selected the prisoners at random. They were taken from their cells at dawn, lined up in the inner courtyard, and shot without trial. In rural areas, the method was even more expeditious. Suspects were captured, interrogated under torture, and then taken to forests or open fields where they were shot and buried in mass graves. One of the militia's darkest practices was the persecution of resistance fighters' relatives. When they couldn't capture the main target, they arrested their wives, mothers, siblings, or children. Many of them were tortured to force confessions or subjected to emotional blackmail. A testimony recovered from the Lyon court archives recounts the case of a pregnant woman who was detained along with her 10-year-old daughter. Both were interrogated for hours. The girl was beaten in front of her mother until she revealed the location of her husband, the head of a local railway sabotage cell. The man was captured the next day and executed. There are also reports of forced evictions, burning of family homes, confiscation of property, and public threats with lists of families collaborating with terrorists. The logic was simple: attack the tree, but also the roots. Many survivors who testified after the war shared one sentiment. Their fear of the Germans was terrible, but their fear of the French milice was even greater. Because they were from the area, they spoke the same language, they knew who was who, and they acted without restraint. A woman detained in Limoges told a court in 1945, "They beat me with a wet hose until my ribs broke. They stripped me naked and hung me by my wrists for hours. One of them, a Frenchman, not a German, told me that if I didn't talk, he would bring my son and make him look." The collaborator as executioner was not a historical accident. It was a political construct fueled by hatred, ideology, opportunism, and often by a thirst for power unleashed under the protection of impunity. The militia and their civilian collaborators turned French soil into a land of fear, silence, and betrayal. For 2 years, they sowed horror in the name of order, obedience, and racial purity. But their punishment would not be long in coming. With the liberation of the country, many would be executed, as has been seen, others tried and convicted. But no punishment would erase the terror sown. In the very heart of France, the executioner spoke French, knew the streets, and used the same flag, only upside down. Who were the traitors? Anatomy of the French collaborationist. In occupied France between 1940 and 1944, not all enemies wore German uniforms. The French collaborator was the silent enemy, often indistinguishable from the neighbor, the shopkeeper, the policeman, the priest. In a context of national humiliation, rationing, propaganda, and fear, thousands of French citizens chose to serve the interests of the Third Reich. Betrayal took multiple forms: denunciation, repression, torture, administration of plunder, and direct participation in mass deportations. The occupation not only revealed the brutality of the invader, but also the moral fragility of the invaded. But who were these traitors, really? What motivated them? Did they act out of ideology, necessity, resentment, or cowardice? This chapter aims to unravel the social and moral anatomy of the French collaborator, not as an isolated or monstrous figure, but as the complex product of a broken society, shaken by collapse, defeat, and occupation. For betrayal was not the exclusive preserve of a political elite or outright criminals. It was a profound phenomenon, rooted in the fears, frustrations, and ambitions of an entire torn nation. Among the first to embrace collaboration were those who hadn't discovered authoritarianism with the arrival of the Nazis. They already carried it within them. They were long-time militants of the French far right, nostalgic for the hierarchical order, sworn enemies of the parliamentary republic. Their rejection of democracy, secularism, and internationalism wasn't born with the war, but incubated for years on the margins of a polarized politics. For these men and some women, the defeat of June 1940 was a divine sign, a confirmation that France needed moral regeneration, a redemptive punishment. They saw in the occupation an opportunity to purge what they considered the nation's impurities: Marxism, Judaism, liberal decadence, a free press, cultural mixing. They were few in number, but they were fanatics. They saw in Germany a model of order, a promise of national cleansing. Some offered their services even before a formal structure existed. The most emblematic case was Joseph Darnand, a veteran of the Great War and a radicalized patriot who eventually swore personal loyalty to Hitler. For him and his followers, the militia was not an instrument of oppression but a moral crusade. They did not consider themselves traitors, but rather restorers of the French soul, convinced they were fighting internal enemies disguised as compatriots. Tens of thousands joined this ideological core with much more material motivations. France, under occupation, was a devastated country. Hunger, cold, unemployment, fear. The economy collapsed, industries were confiscated, crops requisitioned. Amidst this hopelessness, collaboration offered something tangible: a plate of hot food, a salary, a roof over their heads. Joining the militia or working for the Vichy regime meant avoiding compulsory recruitment into German factories. It meant survival. And for many young people without a future, ruined peasants or urban marginalized people, it was also an unexpected path to social advancement. Uniform, authority, respect. The war gave them a place that peace never offered. Some entered as jailers, drivers, administrative assistants. Others were simple opportunists. Their loyalty lay not with Berlin or Paris, but with their stomachs and their fears. For some, collaboration was a way of replacing the fallen power, an adaptation rather than a conscious betrayal. But the result was the same. Every signature on a document, every list drawn up, every complicit silence fueled the machinery of horror. France's internal fractures also provided fertile ground for collaboration. The defeat exacerbated old grudges between social classes, regions, and political beliefs. In many rural areas, resentment toward the city turned into active hatred. In some villages, collaborating with the occupiers meant punishing the wealthy merchant, the Republican teacher, the Jewish doctor. This wasn't about Germany, but about personal revenge disguised as patriotism. Vichy propaganda knew how to tap into this latent hatred, redirecting it toward internal enemies. In this poisoned climate, denunciations multiplied. A rumor, an anonymous letter, a self-serving accusation was enough. Being labeled a communist, a Jew, or a resistance sympathizer could be enough to disappear. The most chilling thing is that often the person making the denunciation wasn't a stranger. It was a neighbor, a cousin, a pharmacist. The occupation turned France into a society of suspicion, and in this dirty game, betrayal became routine. The role of women in collaboration has historically been made invisible or reduced to stereotypes, but it was broader and more complex. Some became romantically involved with German soldiers, which generated public scandal and brutal punishments after the liberation. However, others actively participated as informers, typists, spies, and in some cases, torturers. In Gestapo offices in Paris, it was not uncommon to find French women involved in interrogations. Some acted out of ideology, others out of fear, many out of self-preservation. But their gender did not save them from stigma. After the war, women accused of collaboration were subjected to public humiliation, often without trial or evidence, that included rape, forced exposure, and ritual hair shaving. For many communities, punishing female collaborators was a symbolic way of restoring the violated national honor. But collaboration wasn't always active or violent. There was another kind of collaboration, more silent but equally corrosive, that of professionals, civil servants, and technicians. People without uniforms or clear ideology, but with the ability to facilitate or hinder the workings of the occupation. Teachers who expelled undesirable students, civil servants who authorized raids, doctors who refused to treat wounded resistance fighters, judges who handed down sentences under Vichy orders, postmen who intercepted clandestine messages. Each of these gestures on its own might seem banal, but together they built the necessary framework for the repression to work. This bureaucratic collaboration was in many ways the most effective. There was no need to shout or threaten. All it took was to sign, stamp, ignore. It was a collaboration of paper, of routine, of obedience. Harder to detect, easier to justify, but also more dangerous because it allowed crime to disguise itself as normality. When France was liberated, the traitor's face became eerily familiar. He wasn't a monster. He was the baker, the father of a family, the former war comrade. It was then that the country had to face an uncomfortable truth, that betrayal hadn't infiltrated from without, but had sprung up from within. The anatomy of the French collaborator is a dark mirror. It reflects the grey areas of the human soul under extreme pressure. It shows that in times of occupation and terror, the line between duty and disloyalty shifts easily. Sometimes a signature is enough. Sometimes silence is enough. The final judgment, the Great French Purge. When France was liberated in the summer of 1944, the bells of victory rang out, mingled with cries of revenge. In the days following the fall of the collaborationist regime, there was no time for restraint or moderation. Popular euphoria spilled over into summary punishments. In every square and every street, men and women branded as traitors were beaten, spat upon, executed, shaved, dragged through public streets, or hung from lampposts. It didn't matter whether the accusation was accurate or the product of rumor. The rage accumulated over 4 years of humiliation exploded unfiltered. But such immediate justice, without due process or guarantees, could not sustain the legitimacy of a nation aspiring to be reborn through the rule of law. France had been devastated by the German occupation, but also by its own internal fractures. Charles de Gaulle, head of the provisional government of the French Republic, understood that the country urgently needed more than symbols of liberation. It needed institutionalization. Popular justice had to be stopped before it became an endless cycle of reprisals. The state had to regain its monopoly on force and transform national anger into a legal process that offered punishment but also stability. Thus was born the National Purge, one of the most complex judicial efforts in modern French history. From its first days in power, the provisional government declared the nullity of all laws passed by the Vichy regime, including those that had legalized collaboration with the Nazi occupiers. The goal was to legally erase every vestige of the puppet state, but also to establish a new legal architecture capable of prosecuting tens of thousands of citizens who had participated, actively or passively, in sustaining the enemy regime. On August 9, 1944, the ordinance that would mark the official beginning of this process was passed. It established not only the creation of special purge courts, known as Cours de Justice, but also local juries of honor, the Comités départementaux de libération, whose mission was to evaluate collaborationist conduct in their respective regions. Along with these, the state introduced a unique legal concept, national indignity, a category that allowed for the punishment of those who, without having committed bloody crimes, had benefited from the occupation regime or worked for its interests. Between 1944 and 1951, these bodies tried thousands of cases. Approximately 300,000 cases were opened. Of these, more than 120,000 went to formal trial. The volume of the proceedings was colossal. It involved not only punishing but also classifying behavior, establishing levels of responsibility, and differentiating between ideological, opportunistic, and forced acts. 6,700 death sentences were imposed. Of these, 791 were carried out, most in the first 5 post-war years. More than 40,000 people were found guilty of national indignity, which entailed the loss of civil rights such as suffrage, access to public employment, or receipt of state pensions. At the same time, thousands of people were acquitted for lack of evidence or benefited from clemency measures as the proceedings progressed. The trials were held with all the procedural formalities possible in a country still in ruins: appointed judges, the presence of prosecutors, mandatory defense counsel, witnesses, and supporting documents. However, the emotional context was inescapable. The courtrooms were packed with spectators, many of them survivors, relatives of victims, and former resistance fighters. The pressure was constant. At times, the impartiality of the judges, many of them former resistance fighters, was overwhelmed by the symbolic weight of the accused. It was not uncommon for the hearings to become scenes of social tension, where the demands for justice clashed with the limits of the law. Some cases achieved national notoriety for the position the accused had held within the collaborationist apparatus. Pierre Laval, former Prime Minister of the Vichy regime and a central figure of institutional collaborationism, was arrested in Austria while attempting to flee with the help of the SS. His trial began on October 4, 1945. He was accused of having handed French citizens, including Jewish children, over to the German deportation machinery. His defense was considered cynical and evasive. On October 15th, he was shot after refusing to wear a blindfold and uttering a final cry, "Long live France." Another symbolic trial was that of Joseph Darnand, head of the milice, convicted for his direct involvement in torture, murder, deportations, and persecution. He was captured by the British in Italy, handed over to France, and executed on October 10, 1945, without showing any remorse. The courts also tried broadcasters who spread anti-Semitic slogans, journalists who glorified the Nazi regime, police officers who executed arrest warrants, prison wardens who assisted in torture, and ordinary citizens who informed on neighbors out of fear or convenience. Many of these trials were resolved quickly thanks to compelling evidence: letters, deportation records, signed orders, or survivor testimony. The judicial machinery moved briskly, though not without controversy. Over time, the purge process became the subject of debate both within and outside France. Some considered it a necessary moral reconstruction, others a form of legalized revenge. Historian Robert Arron noted that many trials had been conducted under irregular conditions, under emotional pressure, and with incomplete evidence. The concept of national indignity, although useful from a political perspective, generated legal ambiguity. How was the line drawn between active collaboration and mere survival? Was it fair to punish those holding office under duress? Furthermore, the magnitude of the process and the country's administrative collapse led to errors. Some innocent people were punished without solid evidence, while numerous guilty parties escaped. There was also a political use of the purge. Former personal enemies were unfoundedly denounced. Officials who had previously collaborated began denouncing their former allies to save themselves. In this climate, justice was not always blind. Despite these criticisms, many defended the process as indispensable. De Gaulle himself considered the purge an inevitable stage in the reconstruction of the Republic. It was not just a matter of judgment, but of marking a symbolic boundary. France had to restore its dignity, and that required holding those who had betrayed the nation accountable. Without a purge, de Gaulle argued, there would be no true reconciliation. Beginning in 1947, with the Cold War already in place in Europe and the need for political stability, the French state began to gradually close the chapter on Jewish cleansing. Partial and later broader amnesties were approved. Many former collaborators were reinstated in the public sector. Some even held prominent positions in the 1950s. Figures like Maurice Papon managed to hide their direct responsibility for the deportation of Jews for decades, until they were finally exposed by journalistic investigations many years later. In the following decades, the official discourse shifted. The priority shifted from justice to national unity. Collaboration became an uncomfortable, almost taboo subject. It wasn't until the 1970s that a new generation of historians, filmmakers, and journalists began to review the archives, open forgotten wounds, and ask new questions about that dark period. Through documentaries, books, and belated trials, the memory of the Purge once again occupied a central place in the collective consciousness. The Great French Purge was simultaneously an act of justice, a political necessity, and a human tragedy. It was necessary because no democratic state can be built on the impunity of those who collaborated with a criminal regime. It was tragic because it revealed the deepest divisions of a wounded nation. It was imperfect, hasty, and at times unjust. But it was also a monumental effort to restore the rule of law in a country shattered by war and betrayal. Today, in the light of time, the Purge remains an uncomfortable reminder. Legality alone is not enough to stem collective pain or repair the torn moral fabric. But the fact that France attempted to judge, rather than simply exterminate, remains a civilizing gesture amid a continent in ruins because the final judgment wasn't just held in the courts. It also took place, and continues to take place, in the conscience of a country that learned that its worst enemy could have the same face, the same language, and the same flag.